welcome to Thursdays with Thor. For everyone just tuning in, I'm your host, Locke. Today, everyone is tuning in for the first time because this will be our first episode. Today, I'll be discussing my religious past, which involves Orthodox Judaism, my current spiritual outlook, and how that intersects with the kind of person I am today. So first off, you might be wondering why I call myself by a variant of the name Loki on a show that has Thor in its title, and to be honest with you, I think that most people can be compared to various Norse gods, right? You know, you've got your strong, unbreakable Thors, your wise Odins, and your sweet, loving Balders. Well, I've always been more of a Loki personally, you know. Bit of an outsider, kind of a skeptic, you know. But hey, I mean, we could always use some of Thor's power, right? Well, that out of the way. I grew up in a part of Brooklyn called Borough Park, which houses a large Jewish community. Now, when discussing Judaism, which I realize is a super obscure topic for most people, you really need to understand that there are basically three levels of intensity between sects. There are the Orthodox, who come in many varieties, and are the most intense in terms of their adherence to the Torah and the strictures of Judaism. They don't work on Saturday, keep a strictly kosher diet, and will only marry other Jews. They're super cliquey and form tight-knit communities centered on their synagogues and rabbis. The next level down are the conservative Jews. Conservatives are a little less strict, but maintain kashrut laws, adherence to the Sabbath, and other things, but aren't as strict in many ways. And they don't dress in the traditional garb that distinguishes the Orthodox. Their kashrut laws are more lenient, and the details of that are somewhat outside the scope of this video. Maybe in the future I'll talk about it, I don't know. Anyway, the next level down are the Reform, who essentially treat the Torah and other Jewish holy books as a template to be reinterpreted. The Reform have female rabbis, don't usually maintain kosher, and handle the Sabbath in their own individual ways. Each community will have its own standards, of course, but speaking generally, and I do mean generally, Reformed Jews are by far the most lenient and laid back of all observant Jews. Some congregations are even okay with people marrying outside of the race and religion. There are more obscure sects, such as Jewish revivalism, but most mainstream Jews can be grouped into these three broad categories. So I was raised in an Orthodox community and went to a religious school, which is called a yeshiva, comparable to Catholic school or a madrasa. We were taught to read stories from the Torah, translating the words from Hebrew into English. We covered the 5 books of Moses and the prophets, which is essentially the entirety of the Jewish Bible, right? You know, what you people probably call the Old Testament. Before moving on to books of law, called the Mishnah, which, you know, is like temple era stuff on how to, like, you know, do contracts and stuff. All kinds of fascinating things that you don't care about. Our prayers were said in Hebrew, and we were groomed to be biblical scholars. Our logistical skills polished by our strenuous studies of the endless back-and-forth arguments of the rabbis recorded in the Talmud, which is a commentary of the Mishnah. Many Orthodox Jews end up going to law school, and it's thought that my people's proclivity for managing money and law professions comes from our intense studies of the Talmud. Now, this was expected of us, but something happened shortly before I turned 13, which is when, you know, boys turn, you know, they get bar mitzvahed. I started to suspect that the history of miracles and divine promises depicted in the Bible were mostly fantasy. I learned through independent study that archaeology disagreed with the Bible's depiction of Israel's history, and that, most damning of all, there was really no record of the Jews ever having been in Egypt, let alone as slaves or any of that 10 plagues business. Understand, man, the Exodus from Egypt is like the origin story for our religion. Passover, the mezuzahs on the side of the door. Next time you go to a Jewish household, look to the right of the door frame. Nearly every prayer, the Festival of Tabernacles, also called Sukkot, and pretty much every other holiday is based on either the Exodus or other mythical events that occurred during the Jews' travel through the desert. Think about what you probably know about the Old Testament. Things you've seen in movies, or heard in church, or whatever. Moses splitting the Red Sea, Noah's flood, King David, all that. If the whole Moses story was unsubstantiated, and archaeology and contemporary sources told a different story about other parts of the Torah, then that meant one thing. These tales we were taught as history were mythical. In every facet of the religion, especially the arbitrary parts like the Sabbath and much of kosher rules, were all meaningless. The relics of a brutal Bronze Age desert religion. What bothered me further were the aspects of the stories. There was very little moral value in the exploits of Moses or Abraham. The Jews freely committed genocide in Yahweh's name, and Moses even taught the Jews that it was perfectly cool for them to keep non-Jewish slaves. You know, as in chattel slavery. Not that indentured servitude business some people will tell you the Jews practiced. That, the indentured servitude thing, that was only for Jews who couldn't pay their bills, yo. And even that was pretty barbaric. Check out these verses where Yahweh establishes that he's fine with chattel slavery. It even tells the Jews just how hard they could beat their slaves. Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25:44-46. It's in there, trust me. If you don't trust me, take a look for yourself, man. There was more, and honestly, without the truth statements and claims to historicity, the rabbis bandied about to reinforce the rigid demands of this religion. It crumbled from its own faulty foundations. The only reason to keep praying to this Yahweh character was out of tradition. And by this point in my development, I understood that just doing things because people had done them in the past was a terrible reason to do them. We don't keep slaves anymore, do we? At least not in this country. We let women vote now, right? Again, at least in this country, right? New information and ideas should allow one to overwrite the programming of the past. Such a thing is called progress, and I'm all about enlightenment and progress. Now, here's where I ungracefully transition into my connection to the Norse myths, which have redefined my philosophies and spirituality. I first met Thor in a Spider-Man comic when I was a little boy, which I confess is a pretty hilarious place for someone to meet their god. He was huge, unironically wore a gleaming winged helmet, and wore goofy yellow boots that went all the way up to his knees. And he seemed to fly by spinning his magic hammer like a helicopter propeller. The uncle who normally gave me comic books never gave me any Thor comics, but I was entranced by his gaudy, boisterous Deus Ex Machina in that Return of the Sinister Six story, that I found myself later clicking around on our terrible AOL browser, reading everything I could about the gods of Asgard. I somewhat understood that they were an insular pantheon of gods, as distinct and significant as the mythical beings of ancient Judea or Olympus. But without further exposure or education in that respect, Thunder God, and all of his heroic trappings and weird, dysfunctional family members, receded into the depths of my childhood. Getting back to my disenchantment with Judaism, and my realization that there were probably no such things as gods, I found myself drawn to the inexorable question, why? Why did people feel like they needed gods? People talk about their faith as if it's some sort of virtue, when in reality, they're simply defending their inability to let go of something they have no good reason to believe in, something that influences their life decisions in dreadful ways. There is a double onus on people who subscribe to a given religion, and it's this: how to prove that gods are real and that your gods are the ones you're perceiving. Even if something were undeniably miraculous, it wouldn't be proof of Jesus or Vishnu. How would the preacher evangelizing about that miracle demonstrate that it wasn't Zeus or some other, previously unknown deity flexing their divine muscles? With such an open-ended question, it seems foolish to subscribe to any one denomination. Take away the supposed historicity of the Bible, and there's absolutely no reason to put any stock in any of the Abrahamic religions whatsoever. I threw myself into studies of philosophy, reading philosophers cut from the cloth of Descartes, who I found lacking in intellectual honesty, until I stumbled onto Nietzsche, whose book, The Antichrist, gave my wrathful teenage intellect the courage and ammunition I needed to rethink how I was looking at spirituality. I could talk about the Antichrist at length, but again, that is outside of the scope of this video. Suffice it to say that the philosopher saw himself emulating Abraham, who smashed his father's idols in favor of Yahweh. In the course of the intellectual rampage of the Antichrist, Nietzsche shattered Yahweh in turn, in favor of his idealized man, the Übermensch. Nietzsche saw the belief in religions that placed a heavy emphasis on the spiritual world as opposing science and progress, degrading art and the intellectual development of society at large. The chastity and isolation placed on the most extreme adherents of most religions trickled down into the larger zeitgeist, polluting the virtues of modernity and justifying atrocities. In order to progress, to be saved from this moral and mental blight, one had to isolate themselves from the magical thinking of religion, much like the protagonist from Nietzsche's most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which the protagonist, Zarathustra, comes down from his mountain hermitage with the revelation that God has died. The next major development of my spiritual journey was my discovery of LaVeyan Satanism. Perhaps it is not so, but with my soul reeling from Nietzsche's mad declarations in the Antichrist, it was hard for me to see Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible as anything except for the modern successor for Nietzsche's philosophical revolution. LaVey agreed with Nietzsche that there was no God. If there was one, he wasn't much of a factor. As he defied perception, it didn't appear to meddle in the physical world. Yet there was an issue that LaVey observed, an anomaly in human behavior. People liked ritual. What was more compelling, they seemed to need it. They wanted to believe in some sort of higher power, especially if they could share that belief with others. This need was apparently tied to our nature as social creatures, forming attachments and building communities with others centered around politics, games, and all sorts of other things. LaVey settled this issue in a way that allowed him to maintain his intellectual honesty, all while rejecting the traditional routes of religion with his new system. He created an atheistic, humanistic religion that venerated man above all other considerations, and reversed all the typical Christian virtues that Nietzsche saw as so morally corrosive. The figurehead of this atheistic creed was the most potent rebel in all Western civilization, none other than the fallen one himself, the ultimate adversary, Satan. By living a life that allowed one to pursue their happiness and satisfy their human needs, they were emulating the character of Satan, who rebelled against a tyrannical God and allowed his nature to rule him, rather than allow an unjust power structure to suppress his light. I'm not sure what kept me from falling madly in love with LaVeyan's Satanism. I've certainly read the Satanic Bible many times, and I love the character of Lucifer to death. In fact, I have an edit of John Milton's Titanic, Paradise Lost, that I'm working on, which highlights the devil's narrative arc in the poem. Maybe it was Satan's proximity to the Abrahamic faiths, which I had escaped from so long ago. Honestly, making war seems like more involvement than you want with an idea you don't really want in your life anymore. Yet LaVey's demonically clever understanding that one's God need not actually exist stayed with me. I felt empty. I had nearly reached adulthood without a real father figure, and had lost contact with my mother. Beginning college, I found little solace in my romantic relationships, and was struggling to find fulfillment in my poetry. It was at that point, around the cusp of adulthood, that I found Thor again. On a routine trip to a comic book store, the cover of a Thor comic caught my eye. The thunder god stood solemnly against a background exploding with lightning, his calm, stoic face unfazed by the electrical fury that blazed all around him. Mjolnir, his magic hammer, was clutched tightly in his mighty hands like a holy talisman. I couldn't take my eyes off it, and indeed, the mighty Thor seemed to be waiting for me to come join him, to come to him in his lightning. Even if I was ultimately disappointed by the story told in that particular run on the Marvel Thor comic, it was the JMS relaunch after all. I reveled in the grandiosity and stature of the characters, feeling Thor's fear and frustration as he battled his grandfather, his rage and sadness as he dealt with his feelings towards his father, Odin. It wasn't long before I picked up Kevin Crossley Holland's brilliant The Norse Myths, which sealed my fate. Written in lush, colorful prose, Crossley Holland rewrites the tales contained in the Elder Eddas, while maintaining the meter of the dialogue found in all that ancient poetry. I wallowed in the sorrow of Baldur's death, cheered for Thor's exploits of strength and heroism, and walked with Odin as he quested for his ultimate wisdom. I felt like I had come home, seen the roots of myself in some odd way. There was a fatalism to these myths that appealed to me, a tragic sadness that framed the exciting and wonderful world of the Aesir and their many foes. What was more, the gods were relatable, fearing death and struggling with feelings of lust and rage and sorrow. I saw myself in them, and longed to drink with Thor, to talk with Odin, to toil with Frey. I took to wearing the hammer of Thor around my neck, seeing in its heft a potent symbol for my strength and honor. In times of weakness, I reach for it, and am reminded of Thor fearlessly facing down Jormungandr at Ragnarok, or sometimes standing in the midst of a thunderstorm, serenely gazing out at the world. The gods bring me comfort in a world that seems to strive against me. When I get out of bed in the morning and force myself to go to work, I am like Odin riding Sleipnir to conduct battle. When I resolve a conflict or keep myself from losing hope, I am strong like Thor, god of thunder. Lift the hammer, you're worthy, I tell myself in trying times. And it's true, even if that hammer is conceptual. Live your life without regrets, the voice of Odin compels. And I smile and thank him, because even if he isn't real enough to hear me, the strength and certitude of his mythical character absolutely are. I don't consider myself Asatru, mainly because I feel like there are racial associations that I would rather not deal with. Maybe the term Thorite from the Marvel comic works. I don't know. I'm not too concerned either way. I dabble in runes and other light forms of magic, but I'm not overly big on rituals. I feel like I often channel the gods through my poetry, but I'm open to expanding my practices within reason. Nobody today is a Viking or ancient medieval Germanic pagan, so much of the old ways shouldn't apply. Perhaps in a future video I'll talk about my feelings on specific gods or ritual or whatever. Either way, my name is Locke, and I've enjoyed sharing with you. Thanks for checking it out. Next week we'll be discussing something, I don't know, maybe like, pop culture as a mythology or something. I encourage you to comment. I'd love to have a dialogue about anything mentioned on the show, and we'll try to respond to any comments. Until next Thursday, hail Thor!